Hey, and welcome to the Upload with Mark Pew. I have the great pleasure of having a friend of mine, Jason Parker, joining me from Vancouver, Canada. You can see that we both have our COVID-19 faces on at this juncture as we're relegated to our caves and shelter in place. But Jason is a really smart dude in regards to return to work and disability, and has helped thousands of people in Canada and the United States around that. For those of the people that may be watching, listening to this that don't know you, Jason, can you briefly introduce what you do and what your background is?
Sure. So my background is I actually started in the non-occupational insurance space. So we were doing return to work case management in non-occupational space. So long-term disability, short-term disability, sick leave for employers, and then I kind of stumbled into the workers' compensation industry, doing some training with case managers on how to talk to workers. My background is in human kinetics, so doing actually some biomechanics, injury management, and I stumbled into this industry thinking that this was a good use of my education and my skill set. And when I interviewed for my very first job, they said, well, your job is to help people get back to work. And I said, well, how hard could that be? And realized very quickly that obviously there's people that are fairly easy to go, fairly straightforward, easy cases that go back to work, but our cases were not, our caseload was not that type of person. We were dealing with the more complex ones. And I quickly found out and quickly became frustrated with these kind of refractory cases, and how do we get them back into the workplace, which basically put me on a path trying to understand is what motivates people back to work. Why do some people go back to work? Why do some people have delayed recovery? And why do some people never return to work at all? And so this kind of put me on this path of trying to understand and improve return to work outcomes.
Gotcha. It's funny you use the word stumble twice when you talked about workers' compensation. I think most of the people in workers' compensation have likewise stumbled into comp, and they can't find the door to get out. And so once you're in, it's kind of like the ultimate Hotel California.
Yeah.
So the people that you were talking about originally obviously had a little bit of naivete in regards to return to work, or at least maybe your perspective on it. And it's interesting when we talked and you did a presentation to IIBC, you talked about return as a goal, not as an outcome, which I was in the back of the room and just saw a bunch of people kind of going, what did he just say? Because we've thought in terms of return to work as the ultimate outcome. Can you explain that's a one-word difference, but it's a huge difference in mindset and approach. So can you kind of talk about your perspective on that?
Yeah. So I think there's actually place for both terms. We think about, work disability prevention and, preventing the harm of people being out of work unnecessarily. And the outcome of that is for people to return to work. So as a kind of an aggregate, if we're looking at an aggregate group of people who are off work, we want to be thinking about return to work as a way to prevent unnecessary work disability. On an individual level, though, where we've changed our perspective is when we're dealing with a worker one-on-one is not to treat return to work as the outcome, but to treat it as a goal. And when we do that, we actually have a fundamental shift in thinking about how does a person actually achieve a goal? And, we lean heavily into kind of goal attainment theory at this point. We can apply a lot of those kinds of things kind of as an evidence-informed approach when dealing with the injured worker, thinking about, well, why is it that some people return to work fairly straightforward in a timely manner? And when we interview them, so we've done quite a bit of interviewing of injured workers over the years, and when we interview them, there seems to be this very clear pattern. They talk about my goal is to return to work. And then when we interview other people who have this kind of more delayed recovery, refractory, people who are out of work for 18, 24 months, even we've interviewed people who have, protracted cases 5 years, there's this kind of absence in the way they talk about return to work. And then the other thing that we noticed is that there is this orientation. There's these kind of two orientations, is that some people are kind of recovery focused, meaning that, and we hear this in their language when they talk about, well, I can't return to work until I'm fully recovered. I can't return to work until I'm better, I'm pain-free. And there's this kind of orientation to be recovery focused, which eclipses return to work. So what we notice is that those people who kind of return to work kind of in a timely manner, the way they talk about recovery and return to work is there's this overlapping constructs. It's not that recovery is not their goal, but there's this primary goal of return to work. I need to get back to work for whatever reason. There's a level of importance, purpose, identity, something to gain by going back to work, and as well as something, there's a consequence to not returning to work. On the other side, when we see people who are recovery focused, it's almost like if you kind of put your hands in front of each other, and if return to work is here and recovery is your primary goal, is you can't actually see until you can't see return to work as the goal. So what we do is if we treat it differently and we treat return to work as a goal, then we kind of start applying this with the injured worker in terms of what is their goal choice. Then we get into goal planning and goal striving. And it is a bit of a fundamental shift in the way we interact with injured workers, because then you start asking different questions. You start asking different questions. You start engaging them in problem solving around things that would prevent them from starting towards a goal or persisting when the going gets tough. And it is a bit of a fundamental shift. Whereas when we treat it as an outcome on an individual level, then we start doing system-centric things, saying things like ability to work assessments, functional capacity evaluations, trying to prove the person is capable of working. And when we treat it as a goal, there's much more of a different engagement with the worker.
Gotcha. I think that's really important. And really what you're talking about is the attitude of the person. And you made a quote one time that work disability is the result of a decision of the worker. You also had an equation that you said behavior is a function of personal characteristics and the environment, the context they find themselves in. So what you're talking about, return to work, may be less about the physical impairments that they may have and more about the perception in their brain and how they think and the support structure that they have and ultimately the goals that they have in regards to that. So if return to work is more of a function on how they think about it as opposed to what they cannot do, how do you affect that change in paradigm for those folks?
Yeah, so one of the things we noticed, and we actually developed some personas around this, is that we noticed that there are these, as you mentioned, there's these kind of personal characteristics and of these different groups. And those that return to work on in a fairly timely manner, they're not really high involvement groups. You don't need a lot of intervention with them. You just kind of get out of their way and let them, make it easy for them to go back to work. They have these kind of personal characteristics that it seems to be absent in these other groups. And so what we do is, in terms of how do you affect that kind of change in behavior, is part of it is, one is you have to recognize is that this refractory group is that they come to the table with a different set of personal characteristics, and you can't treat them the same as your kind of straightforward cases or these highly motivated people. And so part of it is to recognize is that, but what we can do is we can get them to do certain things that are kind of we call this the easy groups, kind of fast readies. The fast ready is doing certain things. They talk about it differently. They identify return to work differently. Whereas our other groups, our other two personas, I can actually, in an intervention with them, we have a process that we call motivation action planning, where we actually go through, kind of a 3-step process to get them to identify and say certain things around return to work, around recovery, around their concerns around returning to work. So we get them to talk about the promotion, things that promote the idea of returning to work, and also things that may be identified as inhibiting towards return to work, and have them identify those things, because the fast readies have already done it. They do that automatically. So what we do is we kind of walk them through the steps that Fast Freddy's done, and then we kind of walk them through a couple of problem-solving things where it becomes their decision about pointing in the direction of return to work, which is to your point about the ultimate gatekeeper. And I think this is one of our biggest missteps in the industry, is that we don't really realize who's the ultimate gatekeeper. We think the physician is the ultimate gatekeeper. We think we go to the physician, we ask the physician questions around, can this person work, when really the ultimate decider is the worker. And you know, we find that the proof is in the pudding is when you ask case managers going, you know, have you ever sent a letter to a doctor asking if this person can work, and the doctor signed off and said, yes, they can. And then you went back to the worker and said, hey, listen, your doctor says you can work. And the worker said, my doctor didn't talk to me about that, and I'm not going back to work. And they go back to the doctor, and the doctor pulls the release. And then we go, okay, so who's the actual decider here? And so this becomes part of it, is helping that group of people who may be recovery focused or haven't necessarily made the decision to return to work yet, is helping them actually make that choice. Because once they make that choice, you can see that you get some traction. And when it comes to this, you know, the equation of behavior, of personal characteristics and environment, is that there are things within their situation that inhibit them to behave in a certain way. So part of our engagement is really trying to identify those things to get them to get that traction. And ultimately, it always resides down to the choice. And that choice is a precondition of motivation, that sense of control, that when people are given choices and allowed to make decisions, we see them much more motivated. And that's what we do with this refractory group, is really trying to get them to take those steps that lead to those decisions and choices.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like the leading the horse to the water, but can't make the horse drink it, right? It's the individual has to be prepared and want to go back to work. You know, for those that may be watching this and go, well, that sounds really good from an employer side. Of course, they want return to work. They may not necessarily understand that the industry and workers' compensation, I think, is becoming increasingly aware that worklessness is a comorbidity. It reduces life expectancy, and increases depression, anxiety. The concept of not being able to work, whether you want to or not, the lack of focus, the lack of purpose, the lack of social interaction, the lack of accomplishment is a really big concept. So in my mind, return to work is as equally important, maybe even more important to the injured worker as it is to the employer. So if you can get them back to work, it actually benefits both parties, as opposed to, you know, people historically thinking, well, that's only to the benefit of the employer. I'm a workaholic. My wife tells me on a periodic basis and reminds me of that. I get way too much self-esteem. So I can't imagine if I were ever to a point where my fingers didn't work, or my brain didn't work, or I couldn't get out and travel. You know, I would be absolutely despondent, because it's my persona is really wrapped around that. Not everybody's like that, but help explain how maybe you can introduce that concept of the sooner you get back to work, the more purpose that you're going to have, the better you're going to feel, the more routine you're going to get. Is that a concept that you introduce to kind of validate for them the value of work?
Yeah, you know, that's actually a really good comment that you've had. So two things. One is just to actually pause and just talk about your own personal situation and the identity that you have with working, and your comment of, if I couldn't work, I would be despondent, or, you know, it would have a tremendous impact. And I'm willing to put money on the table that if something had happened to you that prevented you from doing some of the things that you do, that you would find a way. That, you know, one of the things I know about you is you attend a lot of conferences, and the social interaction is really great. And in this COVID environment, one of the things that you've really kind of put your energy into is this video conferencing. So you've supplemented what you would get in a different way. And it's much like what we see with workers with who have this high motivation to return to work, is that they just find a way. They look to alter, they problem solve. And I would be willing to bet that in your personal situation that you would probably find a way. You would find a way to continue on with the work, whether it's through video conferencing. You would probably find that way. So part of that leads me to the second point of, when I was first trained in this job, they said there are 4 reasons why people return to work: financial, self-esteem, social reasons, and something else. And I used to tell people, and I would say to you, and I'd say, Mark, there's 4 reasons why you should go back to work. And this was me trying to set the stage of you to understand that there was a level of importance to go back to work. And I would say to you, it's important to go back for money, self-esteem, social reasons, and whatever that 4th thing was. And that worked for a number of people who went, yeah, that sounds good, except those are not the people that we should be worried about. It was one day I was sitting with a lady and I said, well, it's important for you to go back to work for money, social reasons, self-esteem, and whatever that 4th one was. And she says to me, she goes, well, my husband just sold his business. I've been working on it for the last 10 years. We paid the house off. Our mortgage is, all done. We're set up for retirement. Money's not an issue for me. She said, I pretty much don't like anybody I work with. And you know what? I actually feel pretty good about myself. And I realized at that moment that this was kind of those pivot moments that you have, is that I needed to stop telling people why they should go back to work, and I needed to start asking them why they wanted to. And once they identified with that, and that's part of that choice and decision, once I started asking people why it was important for them to return to work, what was what their concerns about not returning to work were. Once I started asking those questions, then people had this self-identity about the direction that they wanted to go in. And it wasn't me telling them, it was them. And the other thing, too, that really helped is that when we had other stakeholders, like a union or a physician or an attorney, is that what we would do is we would lead with their voice and going, Mark has stated that it's important for him to return to work. I'm just trying to help him get that, and I need your help. And all of a sudden we start getting stakeholders, because it wasn't me that was saying it, it was you. And that was a big learning moment for me at that point. So it's not so much that I introduce the idea that it is important, or that there's a reason to go back to work, but I do create an environment that helps them identify that for themselves. And that's a big deal, because once they do, and some people haven't really even thought about it, and they haven't really considered it. They're so busy in the work comp system, filling forms, attending appointments, doing this, proving they're disabled, being, the system's adversarial. They kind of forget about why they got up every morning to go back to work. And it can be anything. It could be anything. It can be just paying bills. That could be one of them. Or we've got a case right now. I was talking to a lady and she said, it's my safe place. She goes, I feel valued there. I leave home because I know that I get support from my coworkers. I'm like, what a great place to work. But that's her purpose. I can't tell her that. She has to identify for herself.
Gotcha. So helping them kind of discover, and I think it goes back to goals, which is where we started, right? I think people who have created their own goals are almost organically bought into them because it was their idea and it's important to them. Giving someone a goal really isn't all that motivating, but if they've created their own goals, they certainly start off so that's what you're really trying to do, is help them. Maybe they haven't even thought about it. Maybe they haven't said it out loud, but articulating what the value is, then you can use that to help guide them towards that return to work as a goal.
100%. And this is why we lean on goal attainment theory here, is that we know that personal goals are more motivating. I always say this in seminars, is going, when was the last time you woke up early, you set your alarm clock early, you got up so excited, so jazzed to achieve somebody else's goal? And that's when people kind of get it. They're like, oh, and I said, return to work has to be their goal. If it's not their goal, then whose is it? And when are you motivated to achieve something else? And that's why it's really important that we spend some time and we understand what that orientation is for that person. And when it isn't aligned with return to work, because my job is to help them return to work, if they're not aligned with it, then there's conflict, and there's potential for conflict. So I might as well spend a little bit of time at the front end to really try to align our goals together. So I can tell them that that's what my goal is, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's their goal. And that's the big difference.
And I think that's the big paradigm shift for the industry, because the industry talks about return to work and superimposes that goal on all the different stakeholders without really kind of inviting the injured worker along for the journey and helping them decide that. So as we close, I'd love for you to think in terms of speaking to an employer and then speaking to an employee, an injured worker. And what would you encourage both of those parties to do to focus more on return to work as a goal instead of an outcome? Is it tactics? Is it attitudinal? Is it policies? What would you make the recommendations to, again, first for an employer and secondly for that employee / injured worker?
Yeah, so for the employer, there's the work that we do when we're doing policy development with them and program development is that we've actually shifted the language around the prevention of unnecessary work disability. So we don't talk about disability management. We don't talk about managing the medical disability. We can do that through the accommodation process. It will deal with that effectively, but we're actually encouraging employers dropping the language of disability management and working towards work disability prevention. So that's a big shift, and we have to do some education around that about the why. And we talk about the harm that you talked about of worklessness causing harm. So we try to get everybody aligned with that, going, these are your employees, and by not preventing unnecessary work disability through return to work and recover at work, you are creating harm. And we equate it to their safety programs, going like, why do you have a safety program? And they go, well, we don't want people hurt on the job. Why do you want that? Because we care about our employees. We go, okay, so preventing unnecessary work disability creates harm. So we need to have a mechanism to prevent that. So that's what we do with employers. And then the other thing we do is we get down on a granular level is we do some training with supervisors on what are some of the things that they can do to really foster this environment. So when we talk about behavior as personal characteristics and environment, we can change the environment. So we talk about supervisors, calling, asking how they're doing, not necessarily talking about return to work, but making sure that they are aware they're wanted back, staying in touch, keeping them on the grid. So that's kind of how we're designing these kind of work disability prevention programs now. And then we have part of that is also the accommodation process and like what happens with transitional work and accommodation. There's some steps that we want to put in place for that. When we're dealing with the employee, it really depends on it. So if you're talking about the interaction of the employer with the employee, so at the granular level, the supervisor is just reaching out. In some cases with large employers, they have return to work departments, return to work coordinators, and there's some of them that are actually having some interaction with the injured workers. So we do some training about how do you talk to an injured worker, what kind of questions should you be asking in terms of how do you create that decision to return to work, which questions should you not be asking, and what are some of the things that you should be focused on. To deal with the actual injured worker, kind of on an individual level, if you're a case manager, we would have some different questions that you might specifically ask around the importance of returning to work, getting kind of to that, what is, part of triggering those parts of the brain, that neurology that identifies with some of the gains and benefits of returning to work, but also understanding that there is a consequence. So things that are promoting return to work and from a gain and loss, but then also getting them to have those conversations around some of the things that might inhibit that. So fear of re-injury is an inhibitor. So we talk about amplifiers and inhibitors when we're talking about those. I'm going, okay, so you need to identify the inhibitors, but you also need to do these things that kind of amplify that decision. And so that's kind of how we do that intervention. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that came to my mind was, I typically think of the Hippocratic Oath specifically for physicians, but really what you're talking about is there's a Hippocratic Oath for employers as well to first do no harm. Mm-hmm. And I think, extending work disability and not accentuating the value of return to work, not just for the employer themselves, but the employee specifically and their family and support structure. First, do no harm is really important, and the best way that you can do that is to reduce work disability and give them every opportunity to come back to work.
Yeah, and sorry, you just triggered a thought. A friend of mine once said that and this talks about engagement. So from the employer side, we work with employers and really start thinking about engagement of your workers, not just when they become injured, but also engagement as a preventative measure. And a friend of mine once said that injured workers disengaged workers don't need a lot of reasons to go off work, but they need a lot of reasons to come back. And so those are some of the things that we talk to, from a work disability prevention standpoint, is going, engagement is like your safety program. Like, what are you doing for engagement? How do you create this environment where people want to be at work, and not just need? If you rely on people needing to be back to work, then there's this pressure. Usually it's a financial pressure that will be the motivating thing, but that only comes when there is no more money or when the financial pressure is so high. What we really want to do is create this environment where people want to return to work and make that decision. And so part of that is really looking at this from a slightly different perspective. We see risk managers looking at safety and injury rates, but we don't always think about, from a global standpoint, if it's not until the worker decides to return to work that actually anything ever happens, then we really should be focused on how do we create that environment that allows them to make that decision. And that's a bit of a shift as well.
Absolutely. It's a huge difference between want and need. And I think, ultimately what you're talking about is incentivizing and motivating an injured worker to want to go back to work with their own manufactured goals that they understand that's going to get them there. And once they do that, all the rest of the dominoes will fall, because as you mentioned at the very beginning, ultimately they are the kind of the gatekeeper for return to work. Everybody else is somewhat peripheral to that. Well, thank 100%. You so much, Jason. Great information. I always learn something when we hang out, and I look forward to being released from captivity at some point here and being able to hook up with you someplace on planet Earth. But hope everything is well for you and your family, and I look forward to next time we chat.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. It was fun to chat. So you too, stay safe, and look forward to seeing you again.